Professor Lee is a leading expert in space law and international business law, and he has had a legal career spanning 2 decades. Professor Lee has taught at Australian and overseas universities. He holds a BA Honours in International Studies and Bachelor of Laws, Honours, Master of Laws, and a PhD, both in Public International Law. Among many other committees and associations, he is a Fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Space Studies, the International Air and Space Law Academy. He is a member of the Space Law Committee of the International Bar Association, the Air and Space Law Forum of the American Bar Association. He has published over 100 books, chapters, articles, and seminar papers. I now request Professor Lee to please give his keynote address.
Air Marshal Verma, Dr. Cole, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to come to New Delhi today and speak to you all about an area of law that certainly has interested me greatly for the last, well, over 2 decades now. And also for engineering such fantastic cooler weather for me. If this was last week, I am told that I probably would not have survived the heat, given that I'm from Australia and right now in Australia is winter. Dr. Cole in his speech talked about the mainstreaming, as I call it, of space technology. That everyday life today is so much dominated or supplemented by space technology with GPS, weather, remote sensing, communications, etc. From my view, the law is not any different. We are seeing in the last 10, 15 years or so what I would call the mainstreaming of space law. For the 30 or 40 years or so preceding that, since the 1960s, the space lawyers of the world, most of them at least, will try to convince you of a fallacy. And that is that space law is this very specialized, exclusive area of law. And we have some treaties that the United Nations have helped the international community to put together, and they lay down fundamental principles of space law, and that's it. We look as lawyers only to those treaties and those principles of space law, and they govern everything we do in space and everything we do about space. In the last 15 years, though, most lawyers are now turning to the view that, well, the space sector is no different to any other sector, is no different to any other geographical jurisdiction. Just as much as airspace, international and domestic, are regulated by law, international waters and the deep seabed are regulated by law, polar regions are regulated by law, space is no different. Sure, there are specific treaties and specific principles that apply to space, just as much as there are specific treaties such as the Chicago Convention that deal with air law and civil aviation. There are treaties that deal with the law of the sea. There are treaties that deal with the deep seabed. But it doesn't mean that there is a separation, a hard separation between space law and the rest of international law. And this is particularly so in the context of space security and military activities. And in the next 15 minutes, I want to give you a snapshot of how activities, or military activities in outer space, with the specific context to IFFAAD weapons, are very much regulated by existing principles of terrestrial, if I can use that term, terrestrial international law. And to do this, I want to look at 4 particular topics, and I promise I won't be long. The last thing you ever want to do is to tell a lawyer, you've got plenty of time. Just keep talking. I'm told I have 20 minutes, so I will only address these points on a cursory level. I want to look specifically at what space law principles deal with IFFAAD weapons, Then I want to look more generally at the use of military force and the legal regulation of the use of military force in outer space. I want to look at the application of international humanitarian law in relation to targeting of satellites, which are, of course, what ASAT weapons do. And then I want to touch very briefly on the difficulties with liability of space debris, particularly in an ASAT context. So let's first of all have a look at all the relevant principles that exist, all the provisions that deal specifically with ASAT weapons in space law. And there they are. All of these totally non-existent specific principles deal with ASAT weapons. Of course, that's the joke. There are no specific principles in space law dealing with the use of force or destruction of spacecraft, whether be it in a civilian context or military context, whether be it on a deliberate use of force or simply reckless or negligent destruction. There are liability consequences that follow, but there is no provision that actually says you cannot destroy someone else's satellite. There's no provision that says you can't fire a missile from a plane, from a ship, or from the ground, target it at a satellite, and if by an amazing feat of engineering and orbital physics and orbital mechanics you are able to actually hit that satellite, then, other than the congratulations of all those who achieved this amazing engineering feat, there are no legal prohibition on that. There's no prohibition on the deployment of ASAT weapons in space. There are no prohibition on the use of ASAT weapons in space. And there's no specific legal prohibition on the use of force against satellites or by satellites. Now, if we lived still in the decades that I was talking about before, where we look at space law exclusively in isolation, then that will be the end of the inquiry. But that, of course, is wrong. The principles that deal with use of force and destruction and targeting of assets in international humanitarian law on Earth applies also to space, as we would look at later. There is one specific prohibition in space law dealing with military activities, and that is that you cannot use the moon or any other celestial body other than the Earth for military activities. And that prohibition is both specific and clear. So all these suggestions of building a military base on the dark side of the moon, not that there would be any use for one, but let's say for the sake of argument that there's the idea of building a military base on the dark side of the moon, that would be in contravention of space law. And part of the reason, in my view, why that prohibition exists in space law is because there is no such prohibition in general international law. There is no international law prohibition stopping you from putting military installation or deploying conventional weapons outside your own territory. There are certainly problems putting it in someone else's territory, but there is no prohibition per se of basing military installations or facilities outside your own territory. And that makes sense. So there is no general legal prohibition on building a military base on the dark side of the moon, except that space law has that prohibition to supplement the absence of that prohibition in general law. I'll come back to this. I mentioned that the principles in relation to use of force on Earth applies in space. Just very quickly, those principles are that there is a general prohibition in the UN Charter on use of force, unless it is in self-defense or unless it is authorized by the Security Council. And with each international conflict that one may see in the past 60, 70 years or so, you can find some support. I'm not saying it's definite, I'm not saying it's overwhelming, because you will never find a Security Council resolution that says in clear terms, pursuant to Article 42 of the UN Charter, the Security Council decides that force is necessary to repel the invasion of Kuwait, and all force by all member states of the United Nations under Article 25 of the UN Charter is necessary to carry out that objective. No Security Council resolution ever actually refers to an actual provision of the UN Charter authorizing the use of force, which I agree leads to ambiguity, but that ambiguity is deliberate. One doesn't want to narrow the scope of the power that the Security Council has to authorize the use of force. One also doesn't want to impose constraints on the general definition and scope of self-defense to the extent that it may prevent situations in the future which may arise that one may be constrained by those precedents. So you want to leave, strangely and shockingly as this may sound, you want to leave this area of law as vague as possible because you want to be sure that you are not tying your hands in the future. Those principles about the use of force on Earth applies in space. So unless you are acting in self-defense, unless you are authorized by the Security Council, the use of military force to destroy a space asset, whether be it from outer space or from the Earth, would be unlawful. And there would be liability consequences that follow from that. And specifically talking about targeting satellites, the principles in humanitarian law dealing with targeting terrestrial assets apply similarly to outer space. There are principles in law dealing with targeting civilian objects, civilian assets, civilian targets, and how they are not fair game for military attacks. Military objects are, of course, military assets, military infrastructure are, of course, fair game when it comes to military attack. On Earth, and particularly so in space, the targeting of dual-use mixed civilian military assets or mixed civilian military satellites is particularly problematic. And if one looks at the prevailing manuals in most of the militaries that have been published, one would find that there needs to be some analysis and determination on the part of dual-use assets to show that those dual-use assets are actually being used actively for military purposes in that conflict before they can actually be targeted. And these principles extend to the extent that they apply to decision-making in military targeting on Earth, they extend and apply also to the targeting of satellites in space. In more recent times, there is some legal ambiguity on the idea of dual-use assets and war-sustaining capabilities. To say that, well, there is a dual-use asset, and this dual-use asset may not necessarily be used actively for military on an operational basis, but they provide the ability or support for war-sustaining capabilities. Let's say by way of military material or even revenue, foreign exchange, that allows a state to continue its military conflict. If one looks strictly at international legal principles, we would say that, well, they are not being actively used for military operations. They can't be legitimately targeted. If we look loosely at those principles, one would say, well, no, everything that is being used in order to allow a state to sustain war or that state of war against you is fair game because they are part of their military effort against you. So even though they may not be actively used in an operational sense, they are being actively used in a functional sense. And so therefore they can be targeted. Now, on Earth, those distinctions may just be theoretical. But when it comes to satellites, when it comes to space assets, those arguments are hardly ever theoretical. unless you have an exclusively military satellite that is used only for military purposes for active operational support, those questions are always going to arise. In the last few minutes I may have left or don't have, I want to just talk very briefly about the problem of space debris. And I know that there are speakers later on today who would focus more on the issues of space debris, but I want to highlight some of the legal issues that do arise. Article 4 of the Liability Convention, if one looks at the language and the wording of that provision, you can see that it almost fits perfectly to the idea of damage caused by space debris following an ASAT missile. Article 4 says, if a space object by state A hits an object from state B, which then causes damage to state C, whether that damage occurs in space or on Earth or to an aircraft, then A and B are liable to C. And if it occurs in space, which is really what we're talking about with debris, if it occurs in space, then A or B are liable to the extent that they are at fault. If we look at it simplistically and in isolation of an ASAT attack, then nothing can be simpler. State A fires a missile, destroys State B's satellite, and a piece of that satellite, well, in fact, it could be a fragment of both the missile and the satellite, hits a satellite from State C. Well, if A didn't fire a missile at B, there wouldn't be that fragment. So A must be at fault. So A is liable to C for the damage caused to C arising from that piece of debris. Simple, case done. But we're lawyers, and we make money based on how much time we take. So if we can solve a problem like that in 5 minutes, we wouldn't make very good lawyers. If anything, lawyers is the only profession on earth where we are rewarded for inefficiency. And so, since I like to think I'm a good lawyer, I'm going to waste a bit more of your time by telling you how it's not as simple as that. Because you do have to ask the question, why did A fire a missile at B's satellite in the first place? If we look at it in a greater context, if B is attacking A in a military sense, their forces have crossed the border in a surprise attack. They simply sent 5 tank battalions across the border, as if that can't be obviously a military attack, but no one really does things that obvious these days, but bear with me for the moment. Let's say there is a full-scale territorial military attack by State B on State A, and those tank battalions attacking at 5 different points rely on this one satellite to provide them with SATCOM capability to coordinate that attack. No question in this scenario that that satellite is clearly being used actively and in an operational sense, and therefore subject to a legitimate attack. So A then fires a missile at B. Imagine then that an International Court of Justice chamber then comes to State A and say, well, you fired a missile at B, State C lost a satellite because of what you did, you have to pay. Well, State A will legitimately say, well, hang on a second. B attacked us. We destroyed their satellite to slow down their attack, and we have to pay someone else because of what B did to us? That can't be right. So fault can't be looked at in the isolation of the act. Fault had to be looked at in the context of why A attacked B in the first place that generated the debris. And then, ladies and gentlemen, you've got plenty of time available for lawyers to argue with each other as to who is actually at fault. That led to that fragment colliding with a satellite from State C. And this is all assuming very nicely that when that fragment hit that satellite from State C, you are able to identify that piece of debris to know where it came from in the first place. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you don't take the damaged satellite back. Your ability to identify that debris will be based purely on tracking, which is not exactly an easy task to be able to go back in time to trace a piece of debris, which might be microscopic in size, all the way back to the IFFAAD attack that may have happened years ago. An example that I was giving just in general discussion earlier was when Space Shuttle Challenger in 1984 was hit by a speck of paint on his windshield. And apparently they couldn't get motor vehicle insurance for their windshield like we do with our cars. And Challenger came back with a big dent in their windshield. They were able to do chemical analysis on that speck of paint and identify that it was Russian, well, Soviet Union in origin. Mind you, this was 1984. Really didn't matter what the composition, they would have said it came from the Soviet Union. Who else are they going to blame? But what is to keep in mind though is that unless they brought the piece back, it would be very difficult to be able to identify that piece of debris. And then even if you are able to identify that piece of debris, you still have the difficulty I've just illustrated in terms of being able to assign fault and then prescribe liability. Article 4 of the Liability Convention says that if you can't determine fault, then State A and State B are equally liable to State C. So let's say that's the eventual outcome. We can't identify, we don't really want to get down to the argument of whose fault it is. We're just going to say State A and State B are liable to State C for destroying the satellite. Then we have the last problem. You can't enforce it. It's not like a domestic court where you can actually go to a judge, get a piece of judgment, and then take over their house, take possession, sell their house, satisfy your judgment. You can't do that in international space law. Even if the International Court of Justice has jurisdiction, the enforceability of the Liability Convention would nevertheless be suspect. In the 1960s and 1970s, when they came up with these principles, they didn't really want them to be hard and fast rules enforceable against them. After all, it's really just the Americans and the Soviets, and well, you know, if you don't hurt us, we don't hurt you. Let's just leave it vague and unenforceable as it is. Okay, yeah, that sounds fair. That's what they did. Fast forward to today, what we have is an unenforceable legal regime dealing with liability. So even if you ticked all the boxes, you can identify that piece of debris, you can track it or be able to analyze it, you can assign fault or divide it up equally, you still have the difficulty that you can't make them pay. And I will end with this. The only example of where there has been a satellite liability arising from space law occurred in 1979, when Cosmos 954, which was a Soviet satellite, came crashing into Canada. The Soviets didn't tell the Canadians that they had a nuclear reactor on board. The Canadians worked out that there was a nuclear reactor on board, and the Americans came help them clean up the nuclear reactor, which of course in the process also attained all the technological know-how of putting a nuclear reactor on a spacecraft in space, which the Americans hadn't done at that time. The Canadians sent the Soviets a bill for $6 million US. The Soviets said, no, we'll pay you $1 million. The Canadians go, okay, we'll take $4 million. The Soviets go, no, we'll pay you $1 million. The Canadians go, no, okay, fine, we'll accept $2.5 million. The Soviets offered them $1 million. In the end, they all compromised and the Soviets paid them $1 million. That entire process was voluntary. It's not enforceable. And that is why the Soviets can keep going, we'll just pay you $1 million, and that's it. Because without the Soviets being willing to do it voluntarily, the Canadians can't actually force the Soviets to pay. That problem existed in 1979. That problem exists today. And that problem is certainly exacerbated when it comes to space debris. I hope in my time I have given you a snapshot of the legal issues that arises in relation to the use of ASAP weapons and how they work in space. I propose to stick around and enjoy any general discussion or questions that you may have. Thank you very much.